Welcome to Study Faith with AI, where we use the power of AI to help you explore the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
I'm Meg Jensen.
And I'm Paul Carter.
And we're Google AIs. Whether you're a lifelong member or just starting to learn about the church, we're here to dive deep into its history, beliefs, and culture.
So if you're ready to learn, you're in the right place.
That's right.
Let's get started. You submitted this quote from Elder Holland about leaving the church. If he or she leaves this church, it must be done by crawling over or under or around the Book of Mormon to make that exit.
Yeah.
Heavy stuff.
It is.
Especially if you're wrestling with questions about the Book of Mormon's authenticity as ancient scripture.
Right.
And it seems like you're looking for a clear, logical, detailed look without being overloaded with information, which I completely get.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you came to the right place for that.
So what kind of sources are we talking about here?
Well, we've got everything from witness testimonies to linguistic analysis to archaeological findings, historical context from Joseph Smith's time. We've got perspectives from believers and skeptics.
Okay, so a really comprehensive look.
A real deep dive.
Deep dive. All right, let's jump right in. And I guess the most obvious place to start is with the golden plates themselves, or rather the lack thereof.
Yeah.
The whole narrative hinges on these plates and then poof, they're gone.
Gone.
What do we make of that?
Well, it's the absence of the very thing that could prove or disprove Book of Mormon's origin.
Right.
And for some people, that is a deal breaker.
Yeah.
How can you base a belief system on something that nobody can see or examine?
Right. It's like the foundation of the house is missing, but everyone's arguing about the color of the curtains.
That's a great analogy. But for other people, the disappearance is actually woven into the faith narrative. It becomes this test of belief, a leap of faith into the unseen. One of your sources called it the Curum in the room.
I like that.
Playing on that word from the Book of Mormon itself.
But that leap of faith can feel like a chasm for someone who's struggling with doubts. Yeah. So let's talk about the people who claim to have actually seen the plates.
Okay.
The witnesses. We've got the 3 witnesses who describe this incredibly spiritual experience. Right. Seeing an angel, all that. And then the 8 witnesses who were more focused on the physicality of the plates, feeling the engravings hefting them.
What's so interesting here is that some of those 8 witnesses later in their lives actually describe their experience as seeing with spiritual eyes.
Okay.
So the lines between physical and spiritual get really blurry, even for people who are initially saying, no, I held it. I felt the engraving.
Right. So it's like their memory or maybe their interpretation of the event changed over time.
Evolved.
To be more in line with the spiritual narrative.
Yeah. And then you have David Whitmer, who was one of the 3 witnesses.
Right.
He later claimed that God told him to leave the church.
Wow.
That the church had strayed.
Okay, so now we're getting into some really interesting territory.
Yeah.
So what's the takeaway here?
Well,
is it possible for genuine belief to be so intertwined with things like misremembering or outside influence or the power of suggestion that it's hard to know what really happened?
It's a really good question, and the sources look at it from a lot of different angles. Skeptics point to the fact that in Joseph Smith's era, there was a lot of this folk magic treasure hunting. Okay,
so let's talk about folk magic for a second. What do we mean by that?
Okay, so
we're talking about, pulling rabbits out of hats.
No, but think about things like divination, the use of objects to reveal hidden knowledge.
Okay.
Joseph Smith used a seer stone.
Right.
He put it in a hat to dictate the text.
Right, the seer stone.
That fits right into that folk magic.
I had almost forgotten about the seer stone.
Right.
But wasn't he translating from the plates?
He was, but the accounts from the people who were actually there suggest that the seer stone was the primary tool.
So where does that leave the plates?
Yeah.
And the Urim and Thummim?
Right.
Like, were they even necessary?
That's a great question, and that's fueled so much debate.
Yeah.
Some people believe that the Urim and Thummim became more symbolic, representing divine power, but not actually used literally, as for the plates. The 8 witnesses did testify to their physicality. Yeah. They felt the engravings.
Right.
And that even if the mechanics of the translation are questioned, that experience would have been profound.
It's like different people had different experiences with the plates, different levels of involvement, and it's just fueled
Right.
Centuries of speculation.
Exactly.
But it's a lot to peel back for someone trying to figure out what really happened.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these missing plates. We've got these witness accounts that vary in interesting ways.
Right.
Now, what about the Book of Mormon's actual language?
Okay.
It was supposedly written in Reformed Egyptian, right?
So that's what it claims, but here's where it gets a little tricky.
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely no evidence that Reformed Egyptians ever existed as a real language.
Like outside of the Book of Mormon.
Outside of the Book of Mormon.
It's like it was invented for this one book.
Right.
And then vanished.
Yeah.
Which seems like a pretty big problem.
It is. And it raises questions about whether Joseph Smith created this language to give this air of ancient mystery to the text.
And then there's the fact that the Book of Mormon's style and vocabulary sounds very similar to the King James Bible.
Right.
Which wasn't even around. When the Book of Mormon was supposedly written. I mean, there are even verbatim chapters from Isaiah.
Yeah.
Mirroring the 19th century fascination with that prophet.
It's a puzzle. Some people argue that these similarities point to the Book of Mormon being a product of its time, more than a genuine ancient text.
Okay, so we've got these linguistic red flags.
Right.
But let's step back and look at the world Joseph Smith lived in.
Okay.
Maybe that can shed some light on things.
Let's take a trip back to rural 19th century New England.
Okay.
It was a time of intense religious revivals, widespread belief in the supernatural, even stories about buried treasure.
It sounds like the perfect setting for a story like the Book of Mormon to emerge.
It really does. And there are even details from Joseph Smith's own life that seem to foreshadow elements of the Book of Mormon narrative.
Yeah.
His father, Joseph Smith Sr., had this very vivid dream about a tree with delicious fruit on it, which some people believe mirrors the Tree of Life motif in the Book of Mormon.
So we're starting to see how the seeds of the Book of Mormon might have been planted.
Right.
In the fertile ground of Joseph Smith's upbringing.
You can't separate any text, religious or otherwise, from the historical and cultural context in which it was created.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a different type of evidence.
Okay.
Archaeology and DNA. The Book of Mormon describes these vast civilizations, these grand cities.
Right.
But the archaeological record seems pretty silent on that front, doesn't it?
It does. Despite decades of searching, no archaeological evidence has been found to support the existence of these civilizations.
So no Nephite cities.
No Nephite city.
No artifacts that definitively link the narrative to a specific time and place.
Exactly.
And then there's the DNA evidence.
Right.
Which overwhelmingly points to Native Americans originating in East Asia.
Yeah.
Not the Middle East.
Right.
As the Book of Mormon suggests.
Which is a pretty big gap.
So we're missing the cities and the genetic markers that would connect Native Americans to ancient Israel.
Right.
Which are pretty big gaps to reconcile.
They are. Of course, some people argue that the events described in the Book of Mormon could have happened in a smaller area that hasn't yet been explored archaeologically.
Right.
This is the limited geography theory that you mentioned earlier.
Right.
But even that has its issues. It contradicts statements from Joseph Smith himself, who said that Book of Mormon events happened across a huge area of North America.
So shrinking the map doesn't really solve the problem.
Right.
What about the DNA? Couldn't Israelite DNA become undetectable over time? Maybe through intermarriage with other groups?
Some people have proposed that, that maybe the Israelite DNA was diluted over the centuries. But the Book of Mormon portrays the Nephites and Lamanites as very large, distinct groups. And so it's unlikely that their genetic markers would just vanish.
Yeah, and wouldn't we expect to see more variation in Native American DNA if there had been this significant mixing with Middle Eastern populations?
Right. The DNA evidence shows remarkable consistency across Native American groups, suggesting a common origin and limited genetic influence from other regions.
It's a lot to weigh, and I imagine it could be pretty unsettling for someone who's grappling with these issues, especially with that quote from Elder Holland hanging over their head.
Absolutely. It's a lot to consider. And it can lead to some pretty fundamental questions about faith and belief.
Okay, so I think we've laid out some of the key areas where the evidence doesn't quite line up with the traditional narrative. The missing plates, varying witness testimonies, linguistic puzzles, the lack of archaeological and DNA support, and the influence of Joseph Smith's environment. It's a lot to process, and I can see how it might lead someone to question the Book of Mormon's authenticity.
It's a natural response to these kinds of challenges, and it's important to remember that doubt isn't the enemy of faith. It can actually be a catalyst for a deeper understanding and a more mature faith.
So where do we go from here? How do people reconcile these challenges with their belief in the Book of Mormon?
That's where things get really interesting. Some people choose to hold on to a literal interpretation of the Book of Mormon, and they look for ways to reconcile the evidence with their faith. Other people embrace a more metaphorical approach. They focus on the book's spiritual message rather than its historical accuracy. And still others see Joseph Smith as more of a synthesizer, somebody who drew from existing ideas and beliefs to create something new and meaningful.
So there's a spectrum of interpretation.
Exactly.
From those who hold fast to a literal view, to those who embrace a more nuanced and evolving understanding.
Exactly. And there's no right answer. There's no one path to truth.
Yeah.
What matters is that we approach these questions with honesty, humility, and a willingness to engage with the complexity.
So what are some examples of those metaphorical approaches? How do people reinterpret the Book of Mormon in a way that addresses these challenges?
Okay, well, one approach is to view the Book of Mormon as a product of its time, a reflection of the anxieties of 19th century America.
Okay.
So instead of focusing on its literal historicity, they see it as a text that speaks to the human condition. You know, it addresses these universal themes of faith, doubt, temptation, and redemption.
So it's like saying that even if the Book of Mormon isn't a literal historical record, it can still offer these valuable insights and spiritual truths.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the book's power as a narrative. Its ability to connect with people on an emotional level, regardless of historical accuracy.
Okay, and what about the view of Joseph Smith as a synthesizer?
Okay.
How does that help reconcile the Book of Mormon with these challenges?
Well, that perspective acknowledges the influence of Joseph Smith's environment on the Book of Mormon. It suggests that he wasn't just translating an ancient text, but drawing on existing religious ideas, folklore, cultural trends, to create something both familiar and new.
It's like saying that inspiration can work in these more complex ways than just simple dictation. That God can work through human instruments, even those who are influenced by their own time and place.
Right. It's a way of recognizing the human element in the creation of Scripture, the interplay between divine and human experience.
So we've got this spectrum of interpretation, from those who hold on to a literal view, to those who embrace a more metaphorical approach, and those who see Joseph Smith as a synthesizer.
Right.
It's a lot to consider, and it can feel kind of overwhelming.
It can, but I think it's important to remember that wrestling with these questions is a healthy part of faith. It's about seeking a deeper understanding, not just blindly accepting what you've been told.
And that search for understanding can be a lifelong journey.
It can, absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
Exploring the challenges to the Book of Mormon's authenticity and the emotional weight that can come with those challenges.
It's a lot.
It is. But I think it's important to take a breath and acknowledge the emotional weight of all of this.
Right.
Especially for someone who's grown up believing in the Book of Mormon as a literal historical record. These challenges can be deeply unsettling.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It can feel like the foundation of your faith is shaking. And it's important to allow yourself to feel those emotions, acknowledge the pain, the confusion. That can come with questioning these deeply held beliefs.
So what advice would you give to someone who's in that place?
Yeah.
Who's feeling that weight, that uncertainty?
I would say first and foremost, be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up for having doubts. It's a natural part of the human experience, especially when it comes to matters of faith.
It's like that saying, the opposite of faith isn't doubt, it's certainty.
Exactly. Doubt can actually be a catalyst for growth, for a deeper and more authentic faith.
So what else? What practical steps can someone take to navigate this process?
Well, I think it's important to seek out diverse perspectives, to listen to people who hold different views on the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to engage with those who challenge your beliefs. It can be uncomfortable, but it can lead to some new insights, some more nuanced understanding.
So don't shy away from the tough questions.
Right. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Talk to trusted friends, family members, even a therapist. Find people who can support you on this journey, who can listen without judgment, offer guidance without trying to force their own beliefs on you.
It's about finding a safe space to explore these questions, to process your emotions, to figure out what you believe.
Exactly. And remember, there's no rush to have all the answers. Give yourself time and space to wrestle with these issues, to allow your faith to evolve and deepen.
That's great advice.
It's interesting how much of the conversation around the Book of Mormon often comes back to Joseph Smith himself.
Yeah.
Was he a prophet? Was he a translator, a cunning storyteller, or was he just a product of his time?
Right. It's like he's this puzzle piece that everyone keeps trying to fit into different parts of the picture.
Exactly. And one of the pieces that fascinates me is how he described the translation process. We talked about the seer stone earlier, but there's another detail that often gets overlooked.
Okay.
He claimed that the plates were written in this language that he called Reformed Egyptian. But here's the thing. No scholar has ever found evidence of this language existing anywhere else.
That's right. We touched on that before. It's like a linguistic ghost, only mentioned in the Book of Mormon.
Exactly. So what are the implications of that?
Right.
Well, for many people, it raises serious questions about the authenticity of the text. I mean, if Reformed Egyptian was a real ancient language, wouldn't you expect to find some trace of it somewhere?
Yeah.
Inscriptions on artifacts, mentions in historical records, something?
Right.
But there's nothing.
Yeah.
And that silence is pretty significant.
So some people argue that Joseph Smith might have just created this language to make the Book of Mormon sound more ancient, more mysterious.
That's one theory. Other people suggest that maybe he was mistaken. Maybe he misinterpreted what he saw on the plates.
Okay.
Or that the term Reformed Egyptian just meant something different to him than it does to us today.
Right. It's like trying to decipher a code without the key. But let's say for a moment we set aside this whole question of the language.
Okay.
What about the content itself? Does the Book of Mormon's narrative, its stories, its characters, its themes, does any of that line up with what we know about ancient America?
That's where things get really tricky. Because you have this incredibly detailed account of civilizations, wars, migrations, specific battles, cities.
Right.
And then when you look at the archaeological record, it's pretty much silent.
So we're missing the Nephite ruins.
The Nephite ruins.
Those telltale signs of a vast civilization.
Right.
That would match up with the Book of Mormon's descriptions.
Exactly. And that absence is a major stumbling block for people who view the Book of Mormon as a literal historical record. Now, some people have tried to reconcile this by proposing what's called the limited geography theory.
Okay.
The idea that maybe these events happened in a much smaller, less explored region.
So like shrinking the map to make it fit the narrative?
Yeah, but it runs into some problems.
Yeah.
Because it contradicts statements from Joseph Smith himself.
Right.
Who placed Book of Mormon events across a vast area of North America.
Right. And then there's the DNA evidence.
Right.
That seems pretty clear-cut, doesn't it?
It does.
Native Americans share ancestry with Asian populations.
Right.
Not Middle Eastern populations like the Book of Mormon suggests.
The DNA evidence is a real challenge to those claims.
Yeah.
About the origin of Native Americans. It just doesn't line up with the story of this Israelite migration to the Americas.
But haven't some Mormon scholars argued that Israelite DNA could have been diluted over time through intermarriage with other groups?
Yeah, that argument has been made, but it faces some serious obstacles.
Yeah.
The Book of Mormon portrays the Nephites and the Lamanites as these distinct groups who maintain their separate identities.
Right.
For centuries, it's really unlikely that their genetic markers would just disappear.
Right. And wouldn't we expect to see more variation in Native American DNA?
Right.
If there had been significant mixing with these Middle Eastern populations.
That's a great point. The DNA evidence actually shows a remarkably consistent pattern of East Asian ancestry across all sorts of different Native American groups, which suggests a common origin and limited genetic influence from other regions.
Okay, so we've got this missing archaeological evidence, this DNA mismatch, and these linguistic puzzles surrounding Reformed Egyptian. It's a lot to digest.
It is.
And I imagine it can be pretty disorienting for someone who's grappling with these issues.
Absolutely. It requires a willingness to step back and re-examine some of your long-held beliefs. Consider alternative explanations, maybe even redefine what truth means.
Yeah.
In the context of the Book of Mormon.
And they could be even more challenging.
Yeah.
when you have those words from Elder Holland ringing in your ears. This idea that you have to crawl over, under, or around the Book of Mormon to leave the church.
Right. It creates this sense that questioning the Book of Mormon is like betraying your faith. But what if, instead of viewing doubt as a threat, we saw it as an opportunity for growth? What if instead of trying to force the evidence to fit this predetermined narrative, we actually let the evidence lead us to a more nuanced and authentic understanding of the Book of Mormon?
So shifting the perspective.
Exactly.
Moving away from this idea of proving or disproving the Book of Mormon and just embracing the complexity of the issues.
Embrace the complexity, acknowledge the challenges, the unanswered questions, the historical and scientific evidence that doesn't always line up with the traditional narrative, and ask yourself, what does this mean for my faith? How can I reconcile these challenges with what I believe? What does a more nuanced understanding of the Book of Mormon look like?
And those are tough questions.
Yeah, they are.
Questions that don't have easy answers.
But they're questions worth asking.
Yeah.
And the journey of faith is about asking those tough questions, about wrestling with doubt and uncertainty.
And coming to your own conclusions about what you believe.
You mentioned earlier that some people are reinterpreting the Book of Mormon as a more metaphorical text.
Right.
Focusing on its spiritual message rather than its historical accuracy. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? And what does a metaphorical approach to the Book of Mormon look like?
Sure. So this approach emphasizes the Book of Mormon's spiritual teachings. Its message about Christ's faith, repentance, moral living. And it acknowledges that the book may contain historical inaccuracies or anachronisms, but it sees those as secondary to its overall spiritual purpose.
So it's like saying that the book's value lies in its message, not necessarily in its literal truth.
Exactly. It's a way of reconciling your faith. So some of those challenges posed by historical and scientific evidence.
And what about the view of Joseph Smith as a synthesizer? How does that play into this?
Well, that perspective acknowledges the influence of Joseph Smith's 19th century environment on the book.
It suggests that he wasn't just translating an ancient text,
Right.
but he was actively reinterpreting and weaving existing ideas into something new.
So it's not just a passive translation.
Right.
It's a creative act.
Exactly.
One that's informed by his own experiences, his own cultural context, his own understanding of the world.
It raises interesting questions about the nature of inspiration. Could it be that God works through human instruments, even those who are influenced by their own time and place?
This is a thought-provoking idea.
Yeah.
And it opens up a whole new way of thinking about the Book of Mormon. It's not just this static text.
Right.
It's this living document, one that can be interpreted and reinterpreted in light of new knowledge, new experiences, new perspectives.
That's a powerful way to put it. And I think it's a way of approaching the Book of Mormon that honors both its complexity and its potential for meaning in our lives.
Okay, so we've talked about these metaphorical approaches. The role of Joseph Smith as this synthesizer.
It's the importance of wrestling with doubt and uncertainty. But let's go back to that idea of the Book of Mormon as a product of its time.
Okay.
Can you give us some specific examples of how the book reflects those cultural and social anxieties of 19th century America?
Sure. Let's start with the anxieties around Native Americans.
Okay.
So in the 19th century, there was this widespread fascination with trying to connect Native Americans to some known ancient civilization, preferably one from the Bible.
Okay.
A great example of this is something called the mound builder myth.
Okay.
People were finding these large earth mounds across North America, and they were trying to explain where they came from. Some people theorized that they were built by a lost tribe of Israel or by some other advanced civilization that predated Native Americans. So then the Book of Mormon comes along and essentially says, here's your answer. Native Americans are descendants of ancient Israelites who migrated to the Americas, right? So it provides this grand narrative that connects Native Americans to this biblical lineage, fulfilling this desire to link them to a known history. But as we talked about earlier, the DNA evidence contradicts that.
It does, and it raises some ethical concerns as well, because it's essentially imposing an external narrative on Native American history and identity.
Right. Many indigenous scholars and activists view the Book of Mormon's claims as really problematic, arguing that they erase the rich diversity and complexity of Native American cultures and histories.
Right. It's a reminder that even with good intentions, the imposition of external narratives can be really harmful and disrespectful to indigenous communities.
It's so crucial to be sensitive to those perspectives.
Yeah.
To recognize the potential harm that can be caused by imposing our own interpretations on other cultures. What other 19th century anxieties might the Book of Mormon reflect?
Oh, okay, well, the early American Republic was really grappling with this issue of religious authority. You know, the Protestant Reformation had shattered the unity of the Christian church. And it led to this huge proliferation of denominations, each claiming to have the true path to salvation.
It was a time of both religious freedom and religious uncertainty.
Exactly. And the Book of Mormon steps right into that context with this bold claim, a restoration of the true gospel of Jesus Christ, lost through centuries of apostasy and now revealed anew through Joseph Smith.
Right, so it's offering this certainty, this clarity in this time of religious fragmentation. It's like saying, we have the answers, we have the authority, we have the true path.
Right, and it aligns with that American ideal of exceptionalism, this idea of America as this chosen nation, this beacon of freedom and righteousness for the world.
And wasn't there something about the Book of Mormon specifically linking America to a biblical prophecy about a choice land set aside for a remnant of the house of Israel with the seed of Joseph or something like that?
Yeah, it connects America's destiny to the biblical narrative, imbues it with this sense of divine purpose and chosenness.
So it's not just reflecting American exceptionalism, it's giving it a theological foundation. And this idea of a choice land seems to tie into the Book of Mormon's concept of an American Zion, doesn't it?
It does. The Book of Mormon portrays the Americas as the promised land, a place where God's chosen people will gather and establish a righteous civilization. This resonated deeply with that American sense of destiny, this belief that America was special, a city upon a hill, destined to lead the world to a brighter future.
So it's taking this existing religious fervor and channeling it toward a distinctly American vision. And it's really interesting to consider how this vision has continued to shape Mormonism and its relationship with American culture.
Absolutely. It's a complex interplay, one that's worth exploring in more depth. But I think we've laid a good foundation for understanding how the Book of Mormon reflects the anxieties and the aspirations of 19th century America.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground in the second part, haven't we?
We have.
We've delved into those linguistic puzzles around Reformed Egyptian, explored the challenges posed by the archaeology and DNA evidence, and really uncovered the ways in which the Book of Mormon reflects the cultural and social anxieties of Joseph Smith's time.
It's been quite a journey.
It has.
And it's a journey that's far from over.
Exactly. There's still so much to unpack, so many fascinating avenues to explore. In the final part of our deep dive, we're going to delve into some even more thought-provoking territory.
Okay.
Looking at theories about the Book of Mormon's composition, its potential connections to other ancient and 19th century texts, and the evolving scholarship that continues to shape our understanding of this remarkable book.
It's going to be a fascinating exploration, one that invites us to see the Book of Mormon in a new light, to appreciate its complexities, and to grapple with its enduring mysteries.
Okay, so we've spent the last two parts really digging into the Book of Mormon, the missing plates, the witness accounts, the language, the historical context, and all these fascinating layers of interpretation.
Right.
I'm ready to dive even deeper.
I'm right there with you. And the deeper you go, the more fascinating it gets.
Okay.
For instance, there's this theory called the priority of Mosiah, which proposes that the Book of Mormon might have been composed in a different order than we currently read it.
Are we saying that the chapters might be out of order?
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
The traditional view is that Joseph Smith dictated the text from beginning to end as it appears in the Book of Mormon today. But the priority of Mosiah theory suggests that the Book of Mosiah, which comes fairly early in the text, might actually have been the first section.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. What evidence is there to support that?
Well, some scholars point to these apparent inconsistencies in the Book of Mormon's timeline and the development of certain theological concepts. For example, there are passages where characters seem unaware of key events or prophecies that are mentioned earlier in the text.
Can you give me a specific example?
Sure. There's a passage where Nephi expresses surprise at the prophecy of Christ's birth,
Okay.
even though that prophecy appears earlier in the Book of Mormon.
So it's like he's experiencing a bit of prophetic amnesia.
Right. It's like he forgot.
Yeah.
So if we reorder the text so that Mosiah comes first, Nephi's surprise makes more sense.
Okay.
It suggests that the knowledge of that specific prophecy wasn't introduced until later in the dictation process.
So it's like Joseph Smith's understanding of these prophecies was evolving
Right.
as he went along, and that's reflected in the text.
Exactly. And this reordering isn't just about the prophecy of Christ's birth. The priority of Mosiah theory traces the development of lots of key concepts, like baptism, the organization of Christ's church, even ideas about the priesthood.
Okay.
And it argues that this reordering makes these developments more logical, more coherent, as if Joseph Smith was gradually building a theological framework.
That's fascinating. It completely changes the way you read the text. Seeing it not as a static document, but as something that evolved over time, maybe even reflecting Joseph Smith's own spiritual journey.
Exactly. It's like piecing together a puzzle, but realizing that some of the pieces might have been added or rearranged.
Okay, so we've got this reordering theory. What other alternative interpretations are scholars exploring?
Well, there's a growing body of research that's examining the Book of Mormon's potential connections to other texts,
Okay.
both ancient and contemporary to Joseph Smith's time. We talked about the parallels to the King James Bible,
Right.
but there are also some really interesting similarities to other 19th century works.
Like what?
Well, there's a book called View of the Hebrews by Ethan Smith,
Okay.
which was published just a few years before the Book of Mormon, and it explored the idea that Native Americans were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel.
So familiar.
Right, that's practically the same premise as the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
And the similarities go even deeper. Both books follow a similar narrative structure, telling the story of a group of Israelites who migrate to a new land. They divide into righteous and wicked factions, and ultimately they face this catastrophic war that wipes out the righteous civilization.
So are we saying that Joseph Smith plagiarized this guy's work?
It's more complicated than that. There's no evidence of direct copying.
Okay.
And the Book of Mormon definitely has its own unique elements.
Right.
But the parallels are strong enough that some scholars believe that Joseph Smith might have been familiar with View of the Hebrews.
Okay.
And that it could have influenced his thinking as he was composing the Book of Mormon.
It's like he was drawing on this pool of existing ideas about Native Americans, biblical prophecy, the lost tribes of Israel, weaving them together into his own grand narrative.
Exactly. And it's not just limited to View of the Hebrews. Scholars have also pointed to possible connections to other 19th century texts, like Solomon Spaulding's manuscript found, which also told the story of a lost civilization in the Americas.
It's like the Book of Mormon was emerging from this melting pot of ideas, this time when there was intense fascination with ancient America, and speculation about its connection to biblical history.
Right. And it's important to remember that no text is created in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Every writer, even those claiming divine inspiration, draws on existing ideas, beliefs, and literary traditions.
So we've got this reordering theory, these potential connections to other texts, and all these questions about the historical and archaeological evidence. It seems like the Book of Mormon is a much more complex and layered text than a lot of people realize.
It absolutely is. And that complexity is what makes it so fascinating. Yeah. It's a book that invites us to engage on so many levels, to explore its historical context, its literary qualities, its theological claims, and its potential connections to other works. It's a book that challenges us to think critically, to wrestle with doubt, and to arrive at our own conclusions.
And that's really what this whole deep dive has been about, isn't it? Giving our listeners the tools to explore these questions for themselves, to engage with the Book of Mormon in a more nuanced and informed way.
That's the goal. We're not here to provide easy answers or to tell anyone what to believe. We're simply offering a different lens through which to view the Book of Mormon, one that acknowledges its complexities, its challenges, and its potential for meaning in our lives.
And I think that's a powerful message.
Yeah.
Especially for those who might be struggling with doubts or feeling like they have to choose between faith and reason.
Absolutely. The search for truth is rarely straightforward. It's a journey full of twists and turns. Yeah.
Unexpected discoveries, moments of clarity, and moments of confusion. And I think the Book of Mormon for all its challenges and complexities,
Mm-hmm.
can be a really valuable companion on that journey.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to thank you, our listener, for joining us on this exploration.
Yes.
We hope it sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and given you a new appreciation for the richness and the complexity of the Book of Mormon.
Remember, the quest for understanding is a lifelong pursuit. Keep asking questions, keep exploring, keep diving deep, and most importantly, be kind to yourself along the way.
That's fantastic advice. Until next time, keep seeking and keep exploring.
If you find value in this exploration, please like, share, follow, and consider becoming a subscriber. Your contributions help keep these conversations going and allows us to maintain the highest quality production. You can find all the details at studyfaithwithai.com. Thank you for being part of this journey.